adaptation has been framed in terms of identifying what is to be preserved and what is expendable, rather than what can be reformed or gained. Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello, welcome to the podcast. Ross here. For those of you who might be new to the podcast, you're very welcome. My name is Ross O'Kelly. I'm an urban designer based in London. This podcast is all about what built environment practitioners like us can do about the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. We look at topics related to decarbonisation, ecology, community building, and the topic of today's episode, climate adaptation. So I've spoken about climate adaptation before in various episodes, I think, and I've had fantastic guests on to talk about adaptation in various ways. Most recently, I think I had an episode last November, which was episode 59, which was about transformational adaptation. And that was something that I was reading a lot about at the time, and I really wanted to get that out on the podcast and really share that research and that information with people. I think in retrospect, I probably should have recorded this episode that I'm doing right now first, because this is more of an introduction to adaptation as a concept, but it doesn't really matter. We sometimes do things in weird orders on this podcast. This is still a good entry point anyway if you're new to climate adaptation, or if you know quite a lot about it, maybe you've listened to previous episodes. I think it will still help you to sort of get a good bird's eye view of the field of climate adaptation, particularly in cities, and give you a sort of framework for thinking about it. So that's what I really want to do with this episode, is talk about what is climate adaptation, some ways we can think about it in our minds, some of those related topics. And I really want to talk about the three levels of climate adaptation, which are resilience, transition, and transformation. I'll be giving some examples and case studies throughout, and then at the end, I'm going to give some advice for practitioners or some takeaways of how we can all start bringing climate adaptation thinking into our work, whatever it is we're doing. All right, let's get into it. So you may have noticed there's been an awful lot of weather lately. We're really feeling the effects of climate change right now. Last summer, 2022, record-breaking heat waves all across Europe, drought, some places taps running dry from drinking water. In somewhere like Pakistan, the opposite end of the spectrum, they were having massive flooding. Something like a third of the country was underwater at one time, and they're still dealing with the fallout from that situation. And probably many more examples of climate impacts of natural disasters, extreme weather happening around the world that, maybe is not even reported on in the newspapers we read here in Britain and Europe. So there's definitely this feeling and this, I think, realization that we now are in climate change. We're at 1.2 degrees of warming globally above pre-industrial levels, and we're feeling the effects of that. And so we need to adapt to that. Now, climate adaptation might sound, I don't know what it sounds like to you, maybe slightly scary, slightly vague, maybe. But really, it's quite simple. All climate adaptation is it's about changing our behaviors or our built environment or our infrastructure in response to perceived or actual risk, and the risk of climate change and environmental change. So, a really simple example of that is the fact that we adapt our behavior all the time in response to the environment. If it's raining outside, we put on a raincoat, we bring an umbrella. So we adapt our behavior in response to that. And it's the exact same thing. Is that if suddenly we're getting much hotter temperatures, or we're getting greater downpours of rain and more flooding, then we'll naturally adapt our behaviors to that. Maybe taking a different route to work or to school that isn't, flooded because another road is flooded, etc. So there's a real, part of being human is about being adaptive and adapting to different situations. So climate adaptation, at its core, is just that behavior in response to climate risks and to climate change. Some people say, or some people feel, I think, that climate adaptation and climate mitigation are two different things. Some people, I think particularly some activists, focus solely on climate mitigation, which is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore reducing how we're changing the climate, how we're heating the planet. And some people will say that focusing on adaptation is somehow about admitting defeat, and that we can't do both at the same time. Now, I've said previously that climate adaptation and climate mitigation are actually two sides of the same coin, in the sense that often we can do both at the same time. But another perspective that I've read recently is that actually, if you think about the pure definition of climate adaptation, of being a change in our behavior or our institutions or our systems in response to climate change, then actually mitigation is a subset within adaptation. So even if we change our systems and our behavior to reduce emissions, that is a form of climate adaptation as well. So if anyone gives you that argument that focusing on adaptation means giving up, well, just send them this podcast and hopefully that'll help to change their mind. Really the message is that a lot of the things we're doing for mitigation will be climate adaptation as well, and we can do climate adaptation in a way that is also mitigation. So putting them as if they're two different things is actually very unhelpful. I've said that, adapting to change is a very human thing, but not all of us have the same ability to adapt to change. This is called adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is our ability to shape, create, or respond to change. Typically, the kind of assets that we have access to, both physical and intangible, will affect our adaptive capacity. So if we own land, if we have money, if we have savings, if we have more education, if we have more influence, more opportunities, more social ties, all of these things will improve our adaptive capacity. And the other way is true if we're poorer, if we have less money, if we have no assets, no access to property or land, etc., then our adaptive capacity is much reduced. We have a lot less options, So if you just think about myself, I'm a middle-class professional. If I'm feeling the effects of climate change where I live, it's quite easy for me just to move away, and I can probably get a job somewhere else, that's safer, and I have all those options, etc. I have access to a lot of adaptation possibilities. Whereas someone who is perhaps, not working for whatever reason, someone who has a disability, someone with weak social ties, someone who hasn't had the chance to get a good education, etc., will therefore have less options. They'll have a reduced adaptive capacity. This is where the equality and the equity aspect of this comes in, that actually by strengthening social justice, by strengthening equality in our society, we can make sure that everyone has a good base level of adaptive capacity to adapt to climate change going forward. And it's just a good thing to have in life anyway, because the only constant is change. Now, that being said, I think in reality, if things go really bad, if we're talking about societal collapse or a really, natural disaster that really, shakes the foundations of our society, then actually the people with the most adaptive capacity will be indigenous people, hunter-gatherers, farmers, people who work close to the land, people who can build shelter, can find food or grow their own food, etc. They'll be the ones that really have the most adaptive capacity in that sense. It won't be Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or me. Our skills are much more useful within the current, societal and economic structure that we find ourselves. I'm quite good at researching and talking, but I'm not going to be very much use, in terms of mending clothes and, finding food post-apocalypse. So anyway, that was just a bit of a tangent, but something to think about. Essentially, your adaptive capacity is relative to the situation you're in. Now, moving on from this, so we know we need to have an adaptive capacity in order to adapt. But what is adaptation? Let's talk about some examples. Let's talk about some different levels of adaptation. According to Mark Pelling, who is a geographer at King's College London and who wrote a book called Adaptation to Climate Change, there are 3 levels of climate adaptation that we can think about. Level 1 is resilience, level 2 is transition, and level 3 is transformation. I've also referred to this in the past as transformative adaptation or transformational adaptation, and transition, that second level, is sometimes referred to as incremental adaptation. So there's all these sort of different labels and different words flying around, but I'll explain what these three mean and why they're a useful way of framing climate adaptation and what that might mean for us as practitioners. So I'll define each of them quite simply, and then we'll go into detail on each one in turn. So resilience is about the ability of individuals or systems to persist through shocks and stresses. It's about maintaining the status quo. Transition is really about incremental change that guides us from one state to another, but working within the existing systems that we're in. Transformation, on the other hand, is about changing our values, our systems, and our rules in response to climate change. And it's really the most drastic, and it's really about rethinking things from fundamentals. Let's get into resilience. Resilience has become a huge buzzword over the last, I guess, maybe 20 years. And you often hear about resilience in the context of cities and urban planning and that kind of thing. So resilience is the ability to persist or to bounce back from shocks and stresses. If we think about this at the whole Earth systems level, the Earth system is remarkably resilient. We've been trying our hardest to really kill everything and disrupt all the natural systems going on, but it keeps, so far at least, providing a safe, habitable zone for human beings. And we've been pushing it so hard that might be coming to an end, or we might start hitting into those climate tipping points. But so far, there's all these checks and balances built in to the Earth system that makes it really resilient to change, and why it's, been able to be home for life for 3.8 billion years. Looking more at a local level, ecosystem resilience, our local ecosystems around us, we really want those to be resilient. That's a really important thing, because if they're not resilient, that means, they can die back. It means they can transform, they can have a regime shift into a new form that we might not be used to being in, or might not be able to gain a livelihood from, etc. So having resilient ecosystems is really important in the context of climate change, and many studies have shown that having greater biodiversity does indeed provide resilience benefits. It increases resilience within ecosystems. As you can imagine, if you have a monoculture plantation of one tree, if a pest that specializes, or a disease that specializes in that tree, arrives, then probably your whole forest will be dead. If you have a forest that is has all the trophic levels intact, and it has many different species of tree, and it has lots of different plants and undergrowth and all these different things that you would find in a natural forest. If a pest or disease comes along, some parts of that system will die back, but the rest of it will keep on going and flourishing, and it will adapt to that. It has the resilience to keep going through those relatively small shocks and stresses. This thing of diversity increasing resilience is probably true for many things in life, and it's actually encoded in that popular saying, "Don't put all your eggs in one basket." You want to have diversity of places to hold your eggs so they don't all break, essentially. Now, resilience in urban planning and architecture, etc., has largely, as I said before, resilience is about maintaining the status quo. So it's largely been quite defensive. It's been about building seawalls to keep the rising sea levels out. It's been about, hard engineering flood defenses to stop our cities from flooding. But even more like ecosystem-based adaptation could be considered in the resilience frame. So things like planting trees for shade and to maintain a better microclimate. These are things that we can do to try and keep life keep a quality of life within cities as the climate is changing. And often these things are really good and really worthwhile to do. I'm particularly, a proponent of ecosystem-based adaptation, bringing more nature into cities, and that can make us all more resilient. However, we must question the underlying assumption here of what are we trying to preserve? What do we want to be resilient, and is that a good thing? If the status quo, if business as usual, is what's driving climate change, is what's driving pollution and environmental harm, then why would we want that system to be resilient? Surely we'd want the system to transform into a more sustainable form. Many people would argue that the extractive capitalism economic system that we live in is the underlying reason for for climate change and for the damage we're causing to the natural world. Other people would say it's our dualist mentality, a philosophy about nature, about humans being separate from nature. Other people would point to colonialism. There's all these huge big systems and ideas and histories to these things that are remarkably resilient. So, capitalism, if I take that as an example, the economic system we live in is hugely resilient. It's been going for about 500 years. It's survived social upheaval, revolution, different financial crises and recessions, crazy prime ministers and presidents and people who would otherwise wreck the economy. Capitalism always seems to bounce back. In fact, it almost seems to gain strength from these disruptions. Since the 2008 financial crisis, we've had, more neoliberalism, more austerity, more of this capitalist thinking, and of a huge growth in the number of billionaires and the amount of wealth that's traveling from, normal people up to the wealthiest people in society. So we're having more and more of this, it seems. Possibly capitalism is anti-fragile in a way. It seems to gain strength from disruption. And so, many people want to change that system. People like Kate Raworth of Donut Economics, people like Jason Hickel, who's a proponent of degrowth, many other people who not even, those are, recent examples, but all through the last 500 years, there's been people campaigning in different ways for alternatives to this. Also indigenous people, campaigning for a totally different relationship with the natural world and humans and economies, etc. So we have lots of ideas for how this could be changed, but the system is very resilient to change, and it won't transform without a hell of a fight. So obviously that's not a good thing. So that's the sort of dark side of resilience, is that systems that we really ought to change can be very resilient to it. And we possibly are, with the best of intentions, are actually buffering these negative systems, these disruptive systems that really ought to change. We're buffering them more and more against tipping over into a transformational state. Hey, something to think about. Okay, next level 2 of climate adaptation is transition. Transition, as I said, you can also refer to this as incremental adaptation. I have in the past. Mark Pelling calls it transition, so that's what I've used here. It's really about working within the existing systems that are in place, but just trying to shift things incrementally towards a better state. And so it's quite useful to compare this to resilience, just to understand what that actually means. So, for instance, we know that climate change will have effects on how we farm, how we grow food. So a resilience mentality would be, we're going to do everything we can to try and keep the same farming practices going to grow the same things. So we'll use more pesticides, we'll try different seed varieties, etc. A transition would be to say, okay, the climate has changed, I'm going to grow something different. This is happening in the south of England. Those of you outside of England might be surprised to hear there's a booming wine industry in the south of England. Places like Kent and Sussex now have the climate similar to the north of France, that they can grow pretty good white wine. And so a lot of farmers have now transitioned over to that in response to climate change. Now, how sustainable will that be into the future? Is that causing, are they using pesticides, for instance? Is that causing soil degradation compared to other farming practices? Yeah, perhaps, and that it might end up being a maladaptation. But for now, it's making some people a lot of money, I guess. And it's nice to be able to get local wine. So, that's one thing that's happening that people seem quite happy about. Taking urban example, I like to use this example from Paris. The Paris greening permit. And so, like many cities, Paris has realized that it doesn't have the sort of green infrastructure, the sort of urban nature that would make it more resilient to climate change, but also all those other benefits in terms of biodiversity, connection to nature, more resilient food, maybe by growing food. And so instead of sort of doing this in a top-down way, which is what you might expect a sort of city government to do, what the mayor's office in Paris has done is they've created a greening permit, where any citizen in Paris, any resident, can apply for a permit to get permission to basically be a steward of a piece of green space within the city, whatever place they want, in a sense. usually locally to them. And then once they have that permit, they can do whatever they want with it. They can plant trees, they can grow food, they can, do other sort of nature-friendly gardening techniques or whatever within an agreed set of rules, which is like, it has to be organic, it has to be biodiversity positive, etc. So that's a really nice example of a sort of incremental change that it could be quite possible if it's scaled up. It doesn't challenge the existing sort of governance structure of Paris as a city, but it's just something that's quite easily enacted, and it just gives over a bit of responsibility, a bit of opportunity for local residents to take a more stewardship approach. And I think there's a lot of benefits to that. So this is something I think is good. I think it's something a lot of other cities could just take on and do in their own way as well. Now, there's also, in case you hadn't sort of thought of this already, there's also a huge transition happening right now in the architecture and development sector towards sustainability. And so many architecture firms, planning practices, developers are moving away from conventional ways of designing and building places towards more sustainable ways that will be more resilient to climate change, ways that integrate climate adaptation. That to me is a huge transition that's happening now. And that's a really positive one. Obviously, I've had lots of those, kinds of architects on the podcast before, explaining how they do more sustainable buildings, more sustainable design, and trying to share knowledge about that. It's obviously a really positive thing. However, it's not questioning the underlying drivers of why the construction industry might be unsustainable in the first place. Things like profit motive. The developers still are there to make a profit, and they have their assumptions about that, and that may be hampering the use of certain sustainability approaches. There might be other. What about the planning system? It's not necessarily questioning the planning system. The planning system is trying to make little tweaks here and there to enable more sustainable development to come through. But we haven't looked wholesale at the planning system and tried to transform that into something that would fast track sustainable development to happen. So that's a transition that's happening. And I'm going to move into the next topic here, which is transformation, which I've already started talking about. Transformation, as I said, is about rethinking things from the fundamentals. It's about changing values, systems, and or rules in response to climate change. So it's the most drastic, the most sort of extreme example of climate change. I'm going to read a quote here from Mark Pelling from that book I mentioned. He says, "Climate change adaptation is an opportunity for social reform, for the questioning of values that drive inequalities in development and our unsustainable relationship with the environment. But this outcome is by no means certain, and growing evidence suggests that too often adaptation is imagined as a non-political, technological domain and enacted in a defensive rather than a progressive spirit. Adaptation has been framed in terms of identifying what is to be preserved and what is expendable, rather than what can be reformed or gained." End of quote. So I think that's a really good summary, actually, of what are some of the problems with a resilience or a transition approach to adaptation. They don't question the underlying unsustainability. They don't, the idea of reform and transformation isn't on the table, when sometimes it really ought to be, if we want to get to the root of these problems. What are some examples of this? I think there's lots of potential examples, and there's a lot of grey area. There's fuzzy boundaries between all of these levels of adaptation. And so, you could argue one is transition or transformation, that kind of thing. I don't really, care too much about putting things precisely in the right box, but I think it's an interesting conversation to have. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier, new economic and governance structures, things like degrowth or donut economics or steady state economics, etc. This is really coming to the front. There was just recently a big degrowth conference at the European Union where big academics from all around the world, as well as activists, came together to discuss degrowth, the need for degrowth at the heart of the EU. That's amazing. And that really shows that, these things are starting to push up against the mainstream, and they're starting to make a good case for transformation away from a profit-seeking capitalist extractive economic model. Another example for you, which I think could be argued as transformational adaptation, what about rewilding? I did an episode, 2 episodes before this, recently on urban rewilding. And rewilding is really about taking a drastically different approach to the way we manage nature, inside cities and out. Traditional conservation has been very much about finding intact wilderness and trying to preserve it in that state. And it's been also very much about finding particular species that are at risk and then making interventions to help them thrive. Nothing wrong with that. It has done, amazing things. But while we're facing, even though in some places it has worked well, we are globally facing a biodiversity crisis and possibly the 6th mass extinction. The last one was a couple of million years ago when the dinosaurs were wiped out by a meteor. Just to put that into context, what a big thing that is. So rewilding is about taking a totally different view on actually trying to let nature take control, trying to make some interventions at the beginning to try and provoke a more natural state, and then human management stepping back as much as possible to just let nature go forward and do its thing. Really, really interesting. Go check out that episode if you haven't listened to it. I think that it could be argued that's transformational because it's a totally different approach to how we interact with nature in a sense. So there you go. There's a couple of examples for you. There's a big question, I think, on how much we can actually make transformation happen willingly and how much it happens to us. Clearly, our ecosystems can be transformed due to degradation or due to climate change. And clearly, our societies can be transformed because of things like revolutions and things like natural disasters. And equally, we've seen transformations in history where it was a concerted group of people who pushed and pushed and pushed for something until a tipping point was reached. And that's the sort of, activist mentality of keep pushing the system until it can be changed from within. But I think something else to think about is what I've seen termed the dark side of transformation. So this is a scientific article from Blythe et al. 2018 titled Dark Side of Transformation. And they really point out the fact that transformation is often reported in research in quite a positive light as being obviously, and I've done that today. I've talked, very positively about this idea of transformation, this need for transformation. But there's a big question of who decides what transformation is optimal. Who decides what a good transformation looks like? And within that, there can be winners and losers. So a good transformation from my point of view might be a terrible thing for someone else within my community or in a different part of the world. It's not a you don't do transformation on consensus. It can just happen. And usually if it's being pushed, it's influential people who are pushing it or people who have the energy to do that. And so within that, there's this opportunity for people actually to game transformations and to actually take advantage of it for their own profit. We see that, unfortunately, with recessions and natural disasters and things like that, where there's moments of transformation, moments of severe disruption. People with the ability and with the mindset to do it can come in and make a lot of money, who can gain control, who can reach levels of political office within that disruption. So they can game that sort of transformation and bend it towards their own benefit. Clearly, we don't want that to happen. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about transformational adaptation now because I talked for about an hour on it in episode 59, which was titled Why Cities Need Transformational Adaptation. Go and check that out. The link to the episode is in the show description, or just scroll back in your app a little bit and you'll find it. So that's been the sort of framework I want to share with you. Resilience, transition, and transformation. None of them are wrong. None of them are better than others in a sense, but people will argue, for one or the other, depending on your perspective. And I think there's a place for all of them. Resilience approaches are saving lives and will save lives in the short term. In the absence of the ability to transform our society at will, transition can be very powerful and can create a lot of good in the world. And then ultimately, I think aiming for a transformation towards a positive state, or having a sense of when transformation might happen and how we can steer that towards a positive outcome is incredibly important. And that, that's something in the coming decades we need to be very aware of. My key takeaway, I suppose, for practitioners, so if you're someone who's working on live projects, or maybe if you're a student who's working on projects, think about how the 3 levels of adaptation can relate to what you're working on. Question yourself, are you promoting resilience If so, why? Is that appropriate? Are you, promoting resilience of the right things, or are you making degenerative systems resilient in the project you're doing? Can you pursue a more transitional or transformational approach? What would that look like? Could you at least advocate for a more transformational approach? Think about some of the ideas I've used, And ultimately, I think what we want to be doing, if we're doing architecture or master planning or spatial planning in some sense, what we really want to be doing, at least on the basic level, is increasing the adaptive capacity of the population, of communities. We want to be giving people that sense of resilience and robustness and capacity to survive and thrive in the difficult years to come through climate change and biodiversity loss. How do we do that? Well, I think there's a couple of things to think about. One thing is that social connections and strong communities have greater adaptive capacity. They are more resilient innately because you have people to rely on. During the COVID pandemic, people who had neighbours they could rely on, if they were isolating, had people to go out and get groceries for them, had people to check up on them daily, make sure they were all right, do those kind of neighbourly things. Other people who were isolated, sometimes they passed away and nobody found them for weeks. So this is the life or death aspect in an extreme example when it comes to social connections. But also just social connection is so important. We're a social species. It's so important for our health and our well-being anyway. The other thing is biodiversity. And I mentioned this thing earlier about studies showing that greater biodiversity is correlated with enhanced resilience or increased resilience to shocks and stresses. And I think that is really important. So I think, getting in that biodiversity and maybe taking a rewilding approach where appropriate to let nature lead the way on that, on the type of species that should be in an area. You can do that if you're working on a master plan or a building or anything like that. Biodiversity, ecology has to be a part of what you're considering anyway. So engage with an ecologist, try and talk about these issues in an open way and see what you can do to maximize that. And even on a small scale of like adaptive architecture, I think could improve people's adaptive capacity. Having buildings that will be able to be easily modified and changed as over the years to come, because we really don't know what people will need out of their spaces as in the years to come. I mean, there's obvious things like providing shading, on windows so people don't overheat, providing proper levels of insulation and ventilation. I think, architects are on top of that now. They know that, hopefully, and it is getting better. But I think this having adaptive and flexible spaces that the community can use in different ways over the years will be, I think, probably could improve people's adaptive capacity. And this idea of sharing resources, this sort of co-housing model where communities come together and they actually share resources, I think is also an important part of adaptive capacity. So there's a couple of ideas for you. I hope that's helpful. If you had any thoughts on this, please do reach out. You can, find a contact form in the episode description and send me a message. We'd love to hear from you. If you are using Substack, if you're on my Substack newsletter, you can also leave a comment under this post. And I'll get right back to you. So that's it for today's episode. I'll see you next time.